Victoria's new emergency services tax isn't just a levy, it's legalized theft that will force thousands of farmers off their land.
Well, thousands of fed-up farmers and volunteer firefighters have brought Melbourne's CBD to a standstill today as they rallied against Victoria's controversial emergency services levy. They travelled in convoy, blockading Parliament with fire trucks on the state government's budget day, claiming the tax on ratepayers will push rural communities to the wall. The levy is set to take effect July 1st.
It's huge impact on us. The cost is going to be massive, not to mention this year is the driest year on record. We're in a massive drought. It couldn't have come at a worse time.
What I didn't sign up for is for the government to use my name to try and introduce a new tax.
Protest led by the firefighting union. Will you pay the bill?
No, we won't pay the bill.
What do we want? Where do we want it? Now!
If I owned a dairy, I'd be tipping the milk out in the paddock. I'd give up a week's worth of milk just so that you don't get it in the city.
It's all because of this new emergency services levy that's been passed in Parliament. It's left hundreds of CFA volunteers, firefighters and farmers furious. They say this new tax is a kick in the guts, forcing them to pay thousands, if not tens of thousands more every year. And for farmers who are already struggling with drought and soaring feed prices, along with the cost of living pressures.
An extra $5,000 a year.
The government are just trying to burn us, and we're all volunteers and we spend hours and hours out on the fire ground.
This tax is, as we all know, it's just another tax to fill holes in the Labor government's economy.
We spent our Christmas and our New Year's and everything on the fire truck. What were you doing, Jacinta? Were you sitting at home with your family? Well, we weren't, so you can get stuffed, in my opinion.
What happens when a government decides that farmers should pay 3 times more than everyone else for the same services? What happens when a tax increase of up to 189% hits rural communities already struggling with drought, rising costs, and razor-thin margins? The answer is playing out right now across Victoria, where the state government has just rammed through one of the most punishing tax laws in Australian history, disguised as an innocent-sounding Emergency Services and Volunteers Fund. Today, we're going to expose the brutal reality of this deceptive legislation, how it will bankrupt countless farmers, drive up food prices for every Australian, and why thousands of the very emergency service volunteers it claims to support are protesting against it. This isn't just another tax, it's a direct assault on Australia's food security and rural communities. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why this could be coming to your state next. Chapter 1. The Tax Trap. Explained. Let's cut through the government spin and explain exactly what this new tax law really is. Until now, Victoria had the Fire Services Property Levy, FSPL, which helped fund firefighting services across the state. But on May 15, 2025, after a late-night parliamentary session, the government replaced it with the Emergency Services and Volunteers Fund, ESVF. On the surface, this sounds reasonable, expanding funding to cover all emergency services. But the devil is in the details. Under the new law, the variable charge for residential properties has increased from 8.7 cents per $1,000 of capital improved value to significantly higher rates. But the real shock is for farmers and primary producers, who are facing a staggering 189% increase in their variable rate. Let me translate what this means in real terms. A farmer with property valued at $2 million, which is not uncommon for even modest farming operations, will see their annual levy jump from approximately $3,000 to over $8,700 per year. That's an additional $5,700 in taxes every single year. And here's the kicker. This isn't a one-off increase. This is a permanent annual tax that will continue to rise as property values increase. What makes this particularly insidious is that the tax is based on property values, not income or ability to pay. A farmer might be asset-rich on paper but cash-poor in reality, especially during drought years or market downturns. Many are already operating on margins so thin that this additional burden could push them into bankruptcy. The government claims this is about fair funding for emergency services. But if that were true, why are farmers being hit with increases nearly 3 times higher than urban residents? Why are the very communities that rely most heavily on volunteer emergency services being forced to shoulder a disproportionate burden of the cost? The answer is simple but disturbing: because they can. Rural votes don't swing elections in Victoria. This is a cynical calculation that farmers and rural communities can be sacrificed to fund urban priorities. Chapter 2. The Rural Devastation. The human impact of this tax grab is already becoming clear, and it's devastating. Take the case of the Murray family, 5th-generation sheep farmers near Ballarat. Their emergency services levy is set to increase from $4,200 to over $12,000 annually. As James Murray told the ABC last week, "We've survived drought, floods, and market crashes, but this tax might be what finally forces us to sell up." Or consider the Patels, who run a medium-sized vegetable farm in Gippsland. Their levy will jump by over $7,000 per year, the equivalent of their entire profit margin from last season. "We're already struggling with rising input costs and labor shortages," says Annika Patel. "This is the final straw." These aren't isolated cases. According to the Victorian Farmers Federation, up to 40% of the state's farmers are now considering either selling portions of their land, reducing production, or exiting agriculture altogether. The ripple effects will be felt far beyond farm gates. Rural towns depend on agricultural businesses. When farms fail, local economies collapse. Equipment dealers, feed suppliers, transport companies, and retail businesses all suffer. Schools lose students, hospitals lose patients, and communities lose their lifeblood. This tax hike comes as farmers are already battling the worst cost of living crisis in decades, skyrocketing fuel and fertilizer prices, increasing regulatory compliance costs, unpredictable weather patterns, and labor shortages. The government has essentially looked at an industry on its knees and decided to kick it in the teeth. And here's what they don't want you to realize. When farmers can't absorb these costs, they pass them on to consumers. That means higher food prices for every Australian. The very same government that claims to be fighting the cost of living crisis is implementing policies that will directly increase the cost of your weekly grocery shop. Chapter 3. The wider impact on Australians. This isn't just a rural issue. Every Victorian, and potentially every Australian, should be deeply concerned about this tax for 3 critical reasons. First, the immediate impact on food prices. Australia's food supply chain is already under pressure from global disruptions, labor shortages, and extreme weather events. When you add a significant new tax burden to producers, those costs inevitably flow through to consumers. Economic modeling by Deakin University suggests this levy could contribute to food price increases of between 3 to 5% across Victoria within the next 12 months. For the average family already struggling with inflation, that's an additional $780 per year on their grocery bill. Second, this sets a dangerous precedent for other states. Governments are always looking for new revenue sources, and if Victoria gets away with this massive tax hike disguised as an emergency services fund, you can bet other states will follow suit. New South Wales, Queensland, and South Australia are already reportedly exploring similar models. Third, and perhaps most concerning, is what this reveals about the government's attitude toward property rights and taxation. This levy effectively functions as a stealth land tax, allowing the government to dramatically increase revenue without calling it a new tax. The variable component is calculated based on property values, not on income or ability to pay. This means asset-rich but cash-poor Victorians, not just farmers but retirees, small business owners with property, and ordinary homeowners in appreciating areas, are being hit with tax bills they simply cannot afford. What's particularly troubling is how the government has manipulated the narrative. By framing this as funding for emergency services and volunteers, they've attempted to make opposition seem anti-community or anti-safety. It's a cynical political maneuver that uses emergency services as a shield for what is, at its core, a massive tax grab. Chapter 4. The unprecedented protest. The scale of opposition to this levy is unprecedented, bringing together groups that rarely find themselves on the same side of political issues. Today's protest in Melbourne saw over 5,000 people, farmers, volunteer firefighters, rural property owners, and concerned citizens, converge on Parliament House. The sight of fire trucks lining Spring Street and tractors parked outside Parliament is something most Victorians have never witnessed before. What makes this protest remarkable is that many of the protesters are the very emergency service volunteers the levy claims to support. The Country Fire Authority, CFA, with its 55,000 volunteers, has come out strongly against the legislation. As CFA Captain Michael Donaldson put it, "We volunteer to protect our communities, not to be used as political cover for a tax that will devastate those same communities." Many of us are farmers ourselves. We're being asked to pay for the privilege of volunteering and then watch as our neighbors are taxed out of existence. The Victorian Farmers Federation has called it the most significant threat to Victorian agriculture in a generation. Rural councils across the state have expressed their opposition, with many declaring they are deeply reluctant to collect the levy on behalf of the state government. Even the State Emergency Service Volunteers Association has criticized the implementation, stating that while they welcome additional funding, this approach places an unfair burden on rural communities and risks undermining the very volunteer ethos the fund claims to support. The political opposition has vowed to repeal the legislation if elected, calling it a land tax by stealth that rips $765 million a year from Victorian property owners. But for many farmers, the next election will be too late. They'll have already been forced to sell up or scale back operations. What's particularly telling is the government's response to these protests. Rather than engaging with legitimate concerns, they've dismissed protesters as politically motivated and doubled down on their messaging about emergency services funding. This dismissive attitude reveals the contempt with which they view rural communities and their concerns. Conclusion. Victoria's Emergency Services Levy represents everything that's wrong with modern governance in Australia. Urban-centric policies that ignore rural realities, stealth taxes disguised as community funding, and a complete disregard for the economic pressures already facing farmers and ordinary Australians. The brutal truth is that this tax will force many farmers off their land, drive up food prices for all Australians, and set a dangerous precedent that other states are likely to follow. All while cynically using emergency services as political cover. For a government that claims to care about the cost of living crisis, food security, and supporting regional communities, this legislation exposes their true priorities: extracting maximum revenue with minimum political blowback. The question now is whether the widespread protests and community backlash will force a policy reversal, or whether this is just the beginning of a new wave of stealth taxes across Australia. What's certain is that farmers, already pushed to the brink by drought, market pressures, and rising costs, now face an existential threat from the very government that should be supporting them. And every Australian who eats food, which is all of us, will ultimately pay the price. To watch the latest update on Australia's crisis, click the video here. And if you're new to the channel, subscribe now for unfiltered truth about what's really happening to our country. The mainstream media won't tell you these stories, but we will.